Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Petrus Whistler, and this is just going to be a quick video kind of going over how I make a budget for an NSF proposal. Because it's something that I think a lot of people don't have a good handle on exactly what this looks like, especially outside the academic community. So I'm just going to throw out some rough numbers. In this case, I'm going to pretend that I am creating a proposal to design, develop a new robot. Um, I'm going to want a graduate student, a postdoc, to help me with this, and we'll say that it's a 3-year project. 3 years is a very typical amount of time for one of these projects to run. Um, Used to be 4, but stuff has gotten more expensive, and NSF budgets have not grown. So just going through, um, my salary, this is not my salary. I just kind of put this here as a placeholder. But in NSF, you can request teaching release, right? And what this means is that instead of teaching a course, I will use that time to work on research. Typically, you don't ask for this, and unless it's a very specific sort of grant. So I usually don't request anything here. Summer salary, however, is one of the honestly, it's one of the big budget items that you jettison first. If NSF tells you to reduce the budget, this is what you eliminate. This is essentially you requesting funds for summer to work on the project. Typically, professors are not paid during the summer. We are on 9 or 10 month contracts, and our salary is for those 9 or 10 months. Anything during the summer, we are either not paid. Some universities they kind of spread everything out throughout the 12 months, but you're paid on a 9 month basis. But summer salary is kind of an in addition to that. So this is essentially we're asking for money to pay ourselves to do the work that we're proposing. And in general, this is a vast underestimate. If we say that we're going to work on something for, 1 month per year, we're working 3 months per year on it, but we're only asking to be paid for one. So in this, typically what it looks like is that 140 is considered a full month of effort. That's just how they do the math. Um, and if we're paid for a 9 month basis, summer is 3 months. And so this is roughly, this is what we would be paid for an entire summer worth of effort. NSF will only pay up to 2 months of summer salary. But in this case, I'm saying that, 1 month summer salary will is what I'm requesting here. Um, by the way, this worksheet is specific to NJIT, but every single institution is going to have their own version of this. So then you get to professional staff, administrative staff, postdoc. I don't, it is very unusual to have admin staff be paid for here. You might have admin staff if you have something where you are managing a large number of people. If you are, for example, doing a lot of surveys, it might make sense to hire administrative staff to coordinate the disbursement of participant support funds. So typically, I don't do this. Postdoc staff, 61,000 here. This is the minimum amount that we are allowed to pay per various contracts and whatever that NJIT has. 61K is pretty low. As I said, it's the minimum. And when you are offering salaries for postdocs, you don't want to get the bottom of the barrel. You want a good postdoc. And so very typically what you'll do is you'll increase this to 70,000 will be kind of a typical sort of amount that you can go. You can see that this is, $9,000, but that $9,000 might double the quality of the candidates that you're getting applying. Um, for the most part, you know, I would not hire a postdoc for the entirety of a project. But at the same time, you don't want to just do a 1-year contract because then you're going to have difficulty actually getting people interested in it. Because 1 year is for a contract is relatively short. As soon as you're joining, you're starting the job search again. And so in this example, I'm saying that this is a year and a half contract that I'd be hiring for. And you can see I'm putting this into year one, year two. Realistically, it'll end up something more like 6 months to actually find someone, and then they'll work for a year and a half. Um, but you just kind of front load it like this so that you have the funds available when you need them, in case you do have someone in mind. Because if you have a postdoc that you've been working with who's good, is going to be high quality, you can just hire them directly, and so you would need that full year of salary. Temporary salaried staff. This is going to be everyone from kind of lab managers to uh, kind of the administrative staff if they're not full time. So I don't think I've ever asked for anyone here. Going down here, students. So UCAN, non-UCAN. UCAN is the student union for graduate students. The stipend that has been negotiated there is 46,000. And for the most part, you are going to be paying a PhD student for the entirety of these 3 years. And this is one of the big things that NSF supports is the ability to sponsor graduate student research. Now, for people coming from a humanities background, they might be kind of surprised that you're paid for doing a PhD, that you get a stipend. But you have to keep in mind, right, with a STEM PhD student, it's a lot more like a job uh, than perhaps a humanities PhD student. Because STEM PhD students are expected to be in the lab doing work, very much like if they were at a company, because ultimately a lab is basically a small startup company. Um, and you have to consider a lot of these PhD students are coming in with master's degrees. If they went to industry, they'd be making 150K easy, right? The people who are good enough to get into a PhD program are the people who are going to be earning at that higher end of the pay scale. So $46,000. Some people find it surprising that we pay PhD students that much to do their studies, but we're not paying them to do their studies, right? We're paying them to do research. Uh, the biggest shift that I think a lot of students have to go is they have to go from I am a student to I am a research professional, right? And we are paying them to be research professionals. We are not paying them to do their coursework. So anyway, $46,000 is going to vary by institution. Different institutions have different minimum numbers. Um, Sometimes you can increase this a bit to cover some NJIT fees. NJIT charges, say, $2,000 per semester, or I think $1,000 per semester for various fees, which, and so a lot of people, what they do is they will increase this by a bit. But just for example, we're saying 46,000. This is the minimum amount that we can ask for. And the reason that I have a postdoc here is a lot of times you need to really jumpstart a project at the beginning. And so postdocs are really the best option for jumpstarting getting the productivity up and running. Because PhD students, they're learning how to be research professionals. Um, should mention this 46,000 is for academic year plus summer. Undergraduates. So a lot of times you want to hire undergraduates to do grunt work, right? And in the context of robotic development, this might include, you know, doing some design work, running 3D printers, doing some soldering, doing some assembly. It's always a tricky sort of thing to determine what you can give to an undergrad versus a PhD student, um, because ultimately, undergrads come, they go, and you need to make sure that the tasks that you're giving them are going to be something that they can be successful in. Now, in this hypothetical example, what we're going to say is that I want to have one undergrad student during fall semester, spring semester, and then one during summer, right? And we're going to say that the summer is really about not only helping with research, but also uh, running some sort of volunteer program, right? We're going to say that I'm doing some sort of summer camp as part of this. And so What that typically looks like, during the semester, you can typically count on 10 hours per week for a really dedicated undergraduate student, which works out to 150 hours for a 15-week semester. So $1,500 for fall, spring, that's 3,000. For summer, you are competing against internships, so you need to be in that range. All right. However much they would earn in an internship, you want to make it worthwhile. A lot of the students who are doing these summer research experiences, they're not doing it for the money, they're doing it for the enjoyment, but you know, they're also they need to support themselves, right? Especially at NJIT, there's a lot of students who, if they don't work during the summer, it's going to be very difficult for their family. Um, and so being able to pay them for the work that they're doing, pay them for the contributions is, I think, very important. And so in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that I'm going to ask for 10,000, $10,000 per year, right? And really what that represents is fall, spring, for, one or two students, one student who's working full-time for 10 hours a week, one who's working for 5 hours a week, um, and then one person full-time during the summer, just paying $5,000. So, this might sound hand wavy, but ultimately it kind of is. It kind of is hand wavy because uh, research and what you're doing is fundamentally about doing something new. And when you're doing something new, you can't budget out the same thing as if you're doing something that you've done 1,000 times before. So just kind of leaving that there. Now we get to fringe benefits. So fringe benefits apply to health insurance. It pays for health insurance. It pays for, uh, retirement funds, everything like that. And for full-time faculty staff, that is a 37% amount. If you're looking at other sort of examples, this is actually on the low end for how much fringe will cost. Um, and what you can see here is that full-time faculty staff is really only applying um, to the professional staff and the academic year amount. Summer salary does not have fringe applied, which is because we have health insurance throughout the entire year that's baked into our baseline salary, right? And so you don't charge fringe on top of. I don't get extra health insurance for summer salary is basically the reason. So this is really just for the postdoc. Um, for students, students have some amount of benefits that they get. And so fringe is basically paying for this. This is for undergrads. Oh no, it's sorry, it's for graduate students. All right, so this is for the PhD students. Undergrads don't get any benefits, so they don't have that. Um, these numbers are specific to the institution. Equipment. So equipment is exactly what it sounds like. It is a thing, right? It is something that you are going to use for some duration. This might be a computer that in this case, it's going to be something like a robot, right? Um, and so equipment is something that you can purchase. It is something that you can construct. As long as it can be considered equipment, you're basically there. In this case, there are two types of equipment. There is equipment that costs less than $5,000, and there is equipment that costs more than $5,000. Less than $5,000 is verging on what you would consider a supply rather than something big, right? As soon as you have a big piece of equipment, um, that's not something that is being purchased for use by the institution. It becomes something that is an asset for the institution, right? And we'll talk about why this distinction is important in a bit. Um, but the important thing to know is that because capital equipment is considered something that goes into the university, you're not going to need to pay overhead on it. We'll get to that in a bit. For the most part, um, what I might do here, right now, I'm just throwing out sort of numbers. Uh, I might budget, this might represent a laptop that I'm buying. Um, right. A laptop that will be used for the lab, by the lab for a fair amount of time. Um, and it might also represent a 3D printer that I'm buying, right? 3D printers are typically under $5,000. So let's just say that I'm getting, you know, a laptop and a 3D printer. That's what that $3,000 represents. And let's say that during year two, I am building the robot. Uh, and so I need funds to buy the various parts that go into the robot. Um, my lab is very based on building robots, designing robots. Uh, and so I need to guess, right? I would love to say that I can spec out the entire robot uh, before I ask for the money, but that's essentially the work that I will be proposing to do, right? This budget is attached to a 15-page research description where essentially laying out, it's like, here's the question that I'm asking. Here is my proposed approach. Here is, uh, how I anticipate going about it. Um, and so a lot of the work that would be done during year one would be actually, designing the robot and doing some tests and everything like that. Um, and really determining exactly what needs to be purchased for developing the robot. Now, because I don't have real numbers here, I am just going to put in $10,000, right? Um, I'm going to say that whatever robot that I design and build here is going to cost less than $10,000 in material expenses. Um, and one of the important things here is that the capital equipment will also include any labor costs associated with it. So if I had a student, right, working on it during the summer, that $5,000 that I mentioned, I could potentially put, $5,000 here, and that would be considered a $10,000 piece of equipment. Or rather, adding to this 10,000, it would be a $15,000 piece of equipment for the purposes of this accounting. Um, this doesn't matter to NSF, right? The distinction here doesn't matter to NSF, it matters to the institution, and we'll get into why that is in a bit. So just kind of some guess numbers here. I could potentially spec out the laptop and the 3D printer, of course, but a lot of times that's the 3D printer is going to be driven by the specific needs of the project, as is the laptop. For example, I recently bought a laptop for a project that is going outdoors. All right, it's one of those uh, ruggedized laptops. Um, if I bought that at the beginning, if I'd spec that out at the beginning of the project, I probably would have spec'd out an indoor laptop like the one that I'm using right now. Um, but as it turns out, it's going to be important to go outdoors with it. And yeah, so there are these changes of plan that inevitably happen. So that's kind of why these numbers are more general than not. Supplies. Supplies is going to be essentially everything that's not equipment. So this is going to be 3D printer filament. This is going to be nuts, bolts, cleaning supplies for the lab. Uh, it's essentially everything that is consumable, everything that would not be considered equipment, um, office supplies, a printer, toner, paper. Um, again, this is really going to depend on the project itself. For a project that is heavy on hardware, you want to make sure that you have enough money built in to buy electronics, to buy 3D printer filament. Um, this is something that I tend to think a fair amount about, but for the purposes of not dragging this video out, I'm just going to put in $4,000 for the first year. I'm just going to put in this, and this kind of represents the fact that we're buying a lot of supplies at the beginning of the project, and as we get towards the end, we're basically just replenishing. Travel and conferences. Okay, so travel and conferences uh, is an important part of the academic process. So this might include traveling to visit collaborators, right? It might include traveling to visit a specific testing site. Um, it might include going to an academic conference, right? Academic conference, you're going to need some hotels and everything like that. Uh, whenever you go to these conferences and all this, you try to minimize the cost to the extent possible, but ultimately, uh, it's going to have some expense. So let's say, for example, that I'm collaborating with someone at who lives, in New York City, right? So I'm in Newark. New York City is not going to cost me a lot of money to go to. You might say that it's $50 in terms of transit fees, and then if I'm spending all day there, you have a stipend of $100, $200 for food and everything like that. Um, and if I'm making, four trips per year to visit them and to collaborate hands-on, uh, that might be $1,000, right? And if I am traveling twice, this also has to support the travel expenses of my PhD students, right? So it adds up very quickly. I think anyone who has gone on a business trip kind of recognizes that. International travel. Um, this is really going to be for conferences, right? Uh, the the ideal is that you're able to go to conferences that are nearby. However, in the field of robotics, the big conferences that you really want to go to are IROS and ICRA. IEEE IROS, IEEE ICRA. You have RSS in the for robotics software and systems, I think. In the Swarm community, you have DARS, Distributed Autonomous Robotic Systems. Um, and these are all international conferences. They move around every year. Uh, Iris and ICRA in particular are fantastic. They're week long. They have thousands of papers, and the amount of networking, the amount of uh, new ideas that you're able to generate from those conferences, especially, is absolutely massive. And it's very important for disseminating your work, for connecting with others, for really getting a handle on where the field is going. So, because they're international, however, it costs money, right? You're going to be looking at maybe $1,000 for a plane ticket and then $1,000 for food and hotel. And that's on the low end, right? Uh, if the conferences are in Japan, right? So I visited Japan for a conference, and I got a good deal on the flight. I think it was 1,200 bucks. Um, I want to say it was like 2,500 total. This was for my startup funds, so it was less important um, to be super vigilant, right? With NSF funds, you're watching it like a hawk, um, making sure that you're minimizing really the expenses to the extent you can. But yeah, you have to pay for yourself, you have to pay for a student. So I build in enough for one of these conferences per year for myself and a student. And typically what I do is I skip the first year because I'm saying, for the first year, I'm not going to have enough to publish, but during the second, third year, I will. And so typically $4,000, um, which will pay for an international conference. If you are able to put this into domestic, obviously it's going to be cheaper. Well, I say that, but the US can be more expensive than other countries in terms of hotel. So it really does balance out. All right. Lab services. Lab services is going to be stuff like contracting out some engineering work or sending something out to be manufactured. I tend to do stuff in-house, so I am not going to have anything here. Publication services. So publication services are really going to be about the cost to publish something. Um, Journals have fees to publish, right? And for the most part, these publication fees are not necessarily for it depends on the journal. Um, for most journals, the fee for publishing just just publishing is going to be, $1,000. But if you want to publish open access, what open access means is that anyone who wants to download it can. And if you're thinking about it in terms of societal good, you want to publish open access. Typically, it's about $3,000. Um, and so what I do is I say for a journal publication in the last year, I'm allocating $3,000 for that. Subcontracts. Um, so subcontract is going to be really dependent um, on the project itself. And so this might be anything from, I know a professor at such and such institution who has expertise in a very sort of specific field, and I want to allocate some money to her lab to to do some work for me, right? So that would be considered a subcontract. I could also have subcontracts with companies, right? If a company is going to be, providing a decent chunk of, labor, effort, everything like that, um, I would build in some money there for the subcontract. But in this case, we're just going to say I'm not doing subcontracts. Participant support. Participant support is going to be everything from if I'm doing surveys, right? If I'm going out and I'm doing surveys and I'm giving everyone, $10, that would be considered participant support. If I am running a summer camp and I want to, pay for lunch and travel for the students who are doing it, which can be very important, especially for low income individuals. I might want to build in, $200-300 per person for that. For the sake of brevity, I'm just going to say 1,500. Right, so I'm running the summer camp for 3 years, 1,500 uh, covers 5 students. So have that. Now we get to student aid. So student aid is going to essentially be tuition. And this is something that, again, I don't have any control over. Let's say that I am going to bring on a PhD student, a new PhD student, who has a bachelor's degree. They're going to need to take that number of credits for years 1 and 2. And then in year 3, it drops off a lot because they're no longer taking classes. They're doing kind of this, just a research credit. Um, and yeah, it costs a lot. Um, it it does. This can be brought down if I have a master's student, um, someone who comes in with a master's student. But yeah, I mean, typically what you do is you budget for the worst case because you need to be able to support the student. Um, and a lot of times the students that you're bringing on, they're from out of state, especially for New Jersey, right? New Jersey is a relatively small state, doesn't have a massive population. Um, so you want to be able to bring people in from all across the country, um, all across the world. And so you have to build in that possibility. Um, and you can tell it does become significantly cheaper if they are in state, but um, let's see, is there anything else? I don't think so. Okay. So now we get to direct costs. So direct costs is basically the sum of all of these, end line items. MTDC, modified total direct costs. Um, Not everything that I've just budgeted goes into the final budget. Goes is considered a uh, something that has overhead applied to it. So in this case, looking at it, right, you have the total direct costs here, but you're going to subtract off a fair amount, right? You're going to subtract off the tuition, right? Because the tuition is money that is going into the university. Um, you're not going to charge what is called F&A. This is a facilities and administration, which really captures the cost of supporting research, right? This is going to be lab electricity, lab, building depreciation, everything like that. This is negotiated with the federal government, right? This 50.5% number is negotiated with the federal government. It is not something that is arbitrary. Um, and it basically, my understanding is that the university goes to NSF and they go through their finances and they essentially say, based on these numbers, the amount that it costs us um, to support a research project is on average, right? On average, 50.5% of the modified total direct costs. So going back to the MTDC, you subtract off student aid, right? You subtract off participant support, right? This is essentially money that is not going directly into the project. It is kind of going away from it's not going away, but it's getting routed somewhere else. Right. Student aid is not routed into the research project. It's routed to the university. The participant support is not going into the research project. It's going out to these participants. Um, you can see here that the capital equipment, right? If we go here, the capital equipment is not part of this, right? As I said, capital equipment is considered something that becomes an asset for the university, right? So it is not something that is going, this equipment is part of the research project, right? But the actual value of that equipment does not end at the research project. The value of that equipment goes into the university. Therefore, it is not considered part of these modified total direct costs. Um, and I believe that's the last line item, right? And so you can see fringe and personnel costs. All of these things are subject to that 50.5%. And so what you see here is that in the first year, you've knocked off, $30,000. Second year, you've knocked off about $50,000. Third year, it's 6,000 because you've at that point you're basically at the end and you don't have a lot of other stuff. So this 50.5% is applied to the MTDC. Um, Another misconception is that this overhead rate is the amount of the budget that is overhead costs, but it's not, right? So if you're thinking about this, what you can see is that you can see that on average, these facilities and administration costs are 30%, right? Uh, 30% of the overall budget that you have. So in the end, right, after we've done all of this, we get a final budget of $667,000. And typically at this point, what happens is that I've created this initial budget and I have a collaborator and we're trying to fit everything under $1 million. 1 million is a pretty standard kind of upper limit of what programs allow you to ask for. And so at this point, you start making hard cuts, right? You might say, instead of having $4,000 of supplies, you might need to run a bit more lean, right? You might need to decrease that and just kind of hope that you don't run out of money to buy the supplies. Um, and you might have to borrow from future years in order to pay for the current year, and get more grants to kind of cover that gap. Um, Travel, right? You might say that, okay, I really want to bring my PhD student, but I can only afford to go myself for one of these years, right? And maybe this last year I'm not doing as much collaboration. And so instead of traveling domestically this year, I won't. Um, there's stuff that you want to protect, right? The stuff that you always protect is the graduate student stipend and the tuition. One thing that you can do is you can say, okay, I assume that I'm going to have a master's student, someone who's coming in with a master's student, with a master's degree, sorry. And you might say, well, during the third year, maybe during the third year, I just have someone working during fall semester. And maybe I don't have the summer camp in that last year, or maybe during that last year, um, I can't provide support to low income students, right? You can see, you're slowly whittling it down. Um, Another thing that you typically do is you say, okay, instead of being paid for 1 month, I'm going to be paid for half a month. That of course kind of chops it down a bit more. But even then, you really have to struggle to fit it under. Um, and just as an example, right? If I say that I am not doing any summer salary, right? I am not going to hire a postdoc. I'm not going to hire any undergraduate students, right? Uh, I'm just doing the PhD student. I have $10,000 for making the robots themselves, right? That's something that is necessary. I'm saying that any supplies, I'm just going to use what I already have, which is not realistic. I would run out very quickly. Um, I'm not going to travel. I'm not going to publish anything open access, and I'm not going to do summer camp, right? But I am going to have to pay for tuition, right? So the only thing that I have in this budget is the stipend that I need to give my students, right? This is negotiated. The fringe benefits, which is non-negotiable, right? I need to have some funds to do the research, and I need to pay for that. Already, you're at $300,000, right? Um, the money disappears very quickly. So went a bit too far, but yeah. So that's that is essentially the way that an NSF budget is created, a budget for an NSF proposal. Um, and I think one of the fair criticisms is that a lot of the numbers are hand wavy, um, but they're hand wavy by necessity, right? They're hand wavy by virtue of uh, if we knew the exact budget we needed, we would have already done, all the work that we need to do, right? Um, we would have done all the design work and everything like that. And you're going to run into unexpected stuff. Stuff like the travel and everything like that. You're not necessarily going to know which exact conference you're going to go to, right? And so the funds for that are hard to predict, and so you kind of build that in. And yeah, I mean, there's you end up with actually very few levers that you have to pull in order to minimize cost, but you minimize the cost to the extent that you can. So hopefully this was useful. Hopefully this kind of helped people understand how these budgets are made, um, and provide some context for, kind of how research in the US is funded. So yeah, I hope that that was useful. So have a good one.